All right, let's talk about John F. Kennedy today. Who shot John F. Kennedy? We're going to try to answer that question that's vexed people for however many years it's been since November 22nd, 1963. I think this is, of course, a fake newspaper that Kennedy was slain by the CIA, Mafia, Castro, LBJ, Teamsters, Freemasons, and he was shot 129 times from 43 different angles. That's not what happened. But if you take all of the conspiracy theories together, that's what happened. That's what it feels like what happened is all these different people were involved. So we'll chat a little bit about that. And I'm going to post a document that has some links in it to some conspiracy theory videos that I want you to watch. And I'll remind you again of that later on in this lecture. So look for that in this lecture video section. It'll be probably a PDF with some links in it. So keep that in mind as we talk about and think about John F. Kennedy. But first, we're going to talk about his actual presidency, which sadly wasn't very long. I think by almost everyone's account, he was an excellent president and for sure would have been reelected in 1964. But he only served about 2 years because of the assassination. He is the youngest person ever to be elected to be president. Teddy Roosevelt was also very young. They were both 42 years old. But remember, Teddy became president because William McKinley was shot. And so Kennedy here will be elected. He is a decorated war veteran. He's not a general like General Eisenhower, the previous president. We actually won't have any generals since Eisenhower, which seems strange, but perhaps it's the nature of war now. But he was a decorated veteran. He commanded a patrol boat, a torpedo boat in the Pacific. His boat got run over by a Japanese ship, and he got severely injured, but he saved a bunch of his crew and swam. And anyway, he was highly decorated and highly loved and respected for that. A very, very popular candidate. He comes from a long line of politicians. His brothers are both politicians. His older brother was killed in the war. His father is connected to everybody. Of course, the Kennedy name is a large name in the United States still. He's also Catholic, so that kind of threw a lot of people for a loop, believe it or not. They didn't know what to make of that. Would John F. Kennedy listen to the Constitution, or would he listen to the Pope? I mean, that was a real question. You may notice that presidents today, while they may be religious to some degree, they don't tend to identify with any particular group right these days. It's because they're trying not to be offensive, I suppose. Because this was a real challenge. Of course, he won. People got over it and realized that it wasn't as big of a deal as they thought. And I have the word Camelot on here. I think they'll talk a little bit about this in one of the documentaries you watch. The idea of Camelot, number one, Camelot was a musical that came out around this time, and they were pretty fond of it. I would use the term Hollywood to get across the idea that Camelot got across back then. So Camelot's this magical kingdom, and Knights of the Round Table and all that kind of stuff. But really the idea that it's getting at is there's a sort of Hollywood aspect almost to his presidency. He's very young, he's very good looking, he has this young beautiful wife, they have these two little bitty kids, and they're super cute. If you see any pictures of the family, little John is going to be there saluting at the funeral. It's super just photogenic from top to bottom. And there's this sort of magical Hollywood glitz and glamour quality to his presidency. By no means am I implying that it's a smoke and mirrors. It's real, but it just has this feel. I mean, Eisenhower's this old man. He's kind of like your grandpa, right, being president, and most of the presidents have been these older gentlemen. Of course, Truman and Roosevelt. Again, these guys were all in their 50s and 60s. Either going in or coming out of the presidency. It's a sort of a modern thing where presidents are younger, even though our current president isn't. But President Obama was young, President Bush was young, President Clinton was young. So who knows? It's certainly more of a trend in the late 20th and 21st century than it was before. So there's this magical quality. Now there's a couple of major issues, and really the big one is the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then of course the assassination. Unfortunately, Kennedy is famous for being assassinated, and for that assassination being the target of pretty much every conspiracy theory known to man. And I'll give you a handful of them in several. There are hundreds. All right. But first, let's talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we all know Cuba. You can see the map here. Cuba is just off the coast of Florida. Cuba was the subject of a war back in 1898 that we discussed many, many lectures ago, the Spanish-American War. We helped Cuba free itself from Spanish grasp. Cuba was then given its independence and went on their merry way, right? Well, no. Cuba's had huge financial problems like almost all the nations in the Caribbean and the southern part have. Think about what happened. There was a lot of prosperity as a result of the Spanish-American War, of America extending its influence. Remember those banana republics and all these things we talked about? But then along came World War I. And all of our energy then gets focused on Europe and winning that war. And then when we came back, while there was a short period of great economic interest, then the Great Depression hit. And when the Great Depression hit, remember, no one had any money to buy anything. So all those products we were buying from Mexico or Guatemala, no one's buying bananas anymore. No one's buying gas anymore, or oil. No one's buying coffee because they couldn't. And so all those countries suffered. And then right on the heels of that, we went into World War II, and very literally all of our energy was focused on fighting two wars, one in the Pacific, one in Europe. And so South and Central America, the Caribbean has suffered a lot from that. And the end result is some of those countries have turned to communism. And we were unable to keep Fidel Castro and the communists from taking over Cuba. But what is happening now is, because they landed on that communist list, remember, you're either a communist or you're not communist. Once Cuba lands on the communist list, they're cut off. And of course, the only choice they have is to turn to another communist country. They're the only ones that'll talk to them and trade with them. So the Soviets, the Chinese. And of course, in return for help, the Soviets will put nuclear missiles in Cuba. And that is the problem. And I think in the documentary, Michael Douglas will remind us that the warheads were there, but the missiles were being delivered. And that's what we caught. We noticed that was happening. And so, look where Cuba is. It's right off the coast of Florida. You can see the little orange cone is the short range or medium range missiles. The purple cone is the sort of intermediate ballistic missiles, and that technology existed, and that can wipe out half the United States, right? And they can reach Washington, D.C., New York, and so on. And so that's a danger we can't tolerate. And so Kennedy blockades Cuba. You can see all the little ships around there. The Navy's out there. We drew a line in the sand, figuratively speaking, and we said if those ships carrying the missiles cross this line, we're at war. And so this might have been the world's most dangerous game of chicken, right? You've played chicken. You get a bicycle or a skateboard or roller skates. I might have done it in a car once or twice, boats. I've done it in a lot of different stupid ways. But you go as fast as you can, and the winner is the one who doesn't flinch. The loser turns off because he doesn't want to crash. The winner is the one who kept his nerve or her nerve and kept going. But what if neither of you turn? Kaboom. What if you both turn off in the same direction? Kaboom, right? There's a much greater risk of harm, trust me, than there is of victory. And so America and the Russians are playing this great game of chicken. The picture here shows them in an arm wrestling match, but their other hand is on the button that's going to detonate the bombs, right? And this goes back to the arms race thing, an issue that we talked about. The more of these weapons we have, the more dangerous it becomes to fight. And so that's why we haven't had, at least one reason why we haven't had this huge war like we had the two in 1919 and 1945. So here we are in 1962, and we came about that close to going to war with Russia, and that would have ended in basically the destruction of everyone. And so thankful we don't. Now, what happens is the Russians blink, the Americans don't. Kennedy holds firm. At the last minute, you see Khrushchev and Kennedy again there. At the last minute, the Russians turned around and went home. They didn't put those missiles there. And that's what is seen on television. And it looks like Kennedy won. It looks like America won. Kennedy looks like a boss. And Khrushchev looks weak. And it's not surprising that not too long after that, Khrushchev's going to lose his job as the boss of the Soviet Union. The reality is, behind the scenes, we were negotiating through this, and we agreed to remove a bunch of missiles from Turkey. In exchange, they would not put all those missiles in Cuba. So that's kind of the reality. But what is seen on television by most of the world is the Russians flinched. And so Kennedy looks really, really good. Now, unfortunately, not long after this, Kennedy gets killed. So here is the official story. So what happens is Kennedy is in a big train of cars, and he's on a kind of a political tour in 1963. And he's visiting Dallas. He's been in Texas already. He was in Houston a few days earlier. He's in Dallas, and they're in this long, motorcade, and of course all the tops are down. It's Dallas, even in November. It's warm, and no one's thinking about assassination. And he gets killed. He gets shot in the head. And he's shot by Lee Harvey Oswald. Okay, so what happens is he gets shot, 3 gunshots, the motorcade takes off, Kennedy's dead. They go to the hospital, Kennedy's dead. He was shot in the head and the neck. So the new president, Lyndon Johnson, calls for an investigation, this thing called the Warren Commission, which is named after Chief Justice Warren, who, by the way, was the one who wrote the opinion on Brown versus Board of Education, that decision. And so he's investigating with 2 or 3 other people. This panel, they're investigating the assassination. They want to know what happened, why, and so on. And so their determination is that Kennedy was killed by Lee Harvey Oswald. He was acting alone. And of course, he was killed on November 22nd, 1963 in Dealey Plaza, Dallas. Oswald was in the 6th floor of this building called the Book Depository. He fired 3 shots from the 6th floor corner window. 2 of them struck the president. One of those bullets also struck the governor of Texas, who was sitting in a seat in front of Kennedy in that limousine. The fatal round, the second one that hit Kennedy, hit him in the head and killed him. Oswald was caught a little over an hour later after having shot a policeman dead, and he was captured in a movie theater. He was then brought back to the city jail and sort of interrogated, and they were moving him a couple days later when a man named Jack Ruby just walked up to him and shot him. There are very famous pictures. I probably should have put that one on here, of Jack Ruby with a pistol shooting Oswald point blank range while the marshals are basically like, what? And it all just kind of happens like that. So Jack Ruby is a Dallas nightclub owner, and he shot him. Everyone saw it. America saw it. And of course, he went to jail, and he died of cancer in jail years and years later. Right there, you stop and go, wait a minute, there's a lot of funny things going on there. That is the official story that the Warren Commission came up with after months of investigation. And pretty much no one believes the official story. I wish you were here in front of me and we could talk about it. I usually take an entire class period and we just talk conspiracy theories, and we're going to take a little of that time today and do that. But almost no one believes the official story. So Oswald's ruled the loner in the killing. This is called the lone gunman theory, or sometimes the lone nut theory. Again, I'm going to put a list out here of 3 conspiracy theory videos that I want you to watch. You can see this cartoon here. These are the old geezers, right? Who killed him? Well, the mob killed him. Jack Ruby is a mobster. He was a connected nightclub owner. Why in broad daylight would he walk up and kill this guy knowing he was going to go to jail? Ruby always just said, hey, he killed the president. I was angry. But people think there's a connection to the mob. The Kennedy family is connected to the mob and alcohol and all this stuff from their dad. The CIA did it is another popular theory, that they were somehow involved, and Daddy Bush sometimes is somehow implicated in this, right? George H.W. Bush, he was somehow involved in that. Again, there are a million theories. Lyndon Baines Johnson, the vice president, who was just a few cars behind Kennedy, and this is Texas, this is where Johnson's from, and most people think Johnson was a somewhat dirty politician, maybe more than normal. In any case, that he somehow was involved. The Cubans, right, had him assassinated because of this Bay of Pigs thing that we didn't talk about, but it's a kind of a failed counter-revolution against Castro, and it made America and Kennedy and the CIA look bad. The Dallas Junior League, that's just kind of funny. The nurse here says, well, I read that Obama did it, right? So, I mean, there's all kinds of stories that there are second shooters and third shooters, and that the military was involved, and that Oswald is just a patsy. There's all kinds of issues. So this little picture you see at the bottom of the two people, this represents President Kennedy in the back and the governor of Texas in the middle, or in the front. And the red line is this thing called the magic bullet. This is the first bullet that struck Kennedy. It hit him in the neck, or the back of the neck, came out his throat, and then hit the right side of the governor. And so you can see that doesn't make any sense, right? This is called the magic bullet, because they couldn't explain how this happened, because Kennedy took the wound in the neck and it came out his throat, and then the bullet enters the governor in his back and comes out his chest, just from his ribs on one side, and then it hits him in the wrist, and then it turns again and it ends up in his leg. So they call this the magic bullet, and everyone says, no, that's impossible. Well, one of the videos I'm going to have you watch will explain the best way I've ever heard it explained what actually happened here, and it looks nothing like that. But the point here is there are all sorts of conspiracies that people were involved. Some say Israel somehow was involved because we weren't handing over nuclear technology to them. Some argue that there are all kinds of different shooters. If you actually go to Dealey Plaza, which I would highly recommend you do if you get a chance, if you go to Dallas, go to this area. Of course, there's museums and junk stores, and you can go up into the place where Oswald was. There's a guy there, usually has a table set up, selling you DVDs and books about other conspiracy theories. There was a movie called JFK that came out many years ago now. I want to say in the 90s, but maybe early 2000s, with Kevin Costner playing this FBI investigator. And there's a theory about Israel. Again, there's all these other theories. The grassy knoll theory is the one this guy in Dealey Plaza is going to tell you, that there was a person perched in front of the president, because there is a video, it's a really bad one, of the president's actual shooting. And so for a minute, let's just talk about conspiracy theories. And again, I want you to watch the 3 conspiracy theory videos that I put. 2 of them are very, very short. They're like 5 or 10 minutes long. One of them's a 2-hour movie. I really would like you to just watch the first hour. It's called JFK, the Smoking Gun. One of them's about Star Wars. So if you're familiar with the Star Wars saga, especially the original one, they're going to make a conspiracy theory video about why the Death Star was destroyed. And I want you to watch that. And then the second one is a conspiracy theory about, did Kennedy actually die, or was this a hoax to let Kennedy go and work in this sort of underground capacity? And he'll talk about the Kennedy curse, they'll talk about Watergate, and all this good stuff. The JFK Smoking Gun is a documentary of an Australian policeman who investigates the shooting as if it were a cold case and a crime, and he looks at the ballistics, and he comes to some, and this is based on work that had been done previously, some pretty interesting conclusions. And he does agree there's a second shooter, but it's not who you think. And again, they do explain the so-called magic bullet. So I'll put that link out there, and I want you to watch those if you can, for sure. But the kind of the thing I want you to be thinking about is conspiracy theories, and how do you know something's right or wrong? And we're now used to the idea of fake news, and that's what conspiracy theories can be. Some of them certainly can be right. The problem is they don't have enough proof. And what you'll find very common with conspiracy theories is they will ask a lot of questions, but they will not have a lot of answers. And often they will have pictures or video, but that picture and video isn't real good quality, so it's really hard to see what you're looking at. So it's like UFO pictures. You may have noticed that the number of UFO sightings has gone down since everyone has their own cell phone camera and takes really good quality pictures. So I'm not saying they don't happen, but I think the numbers have been reduced a lot. So if you take grainy photos and pictures, and you take a lot of questions, and of course the Warren Commission leaves a lot to be desired. There's a lot of questions. How do you account for this magic bullet? How do you account for him firing 3 rounds out of the window, which is basically impossible. There's all sorts of questions. Why did Jack Ruby kill him? Who was Lee Harvey Oswald? You go on and on. I could sit here and talk about this stuff for hours. And you may have watched some of these documentaries before, but definitely watch the 3 that I give you. They'll illustrate how easy it is to make a conspiracy theory work. And so the Star Wars one, for example, they'll take the story of Star Wars, assume that Star Wars movies 4, 5, and 6, the original trilogy, are the truth, and then they'll rewrite the truth using pictures, and they'll ask questions, and they'll talk about coincidences, and they'll make the whole situation completely different. And they'll say, doesn't it make more sense that it happened this way than that some kid from the middle of nowhere just happened to be able to do this thing and he had no training? Which is, of course, how the real story goes. And you'll get to the end of that video and you go, yeah, it totally makes more sense that it happened this new way, only it didn't. And that's kind of how conspiracy theories work. So you just want to watch that and be careful. You want good evidence. There are conspiracy theories about everything that's happened. Oklahoma City bombing, the anniversary was just a couple of days ago. There are conspiracy theories about that. Of course, the 9/11 attacks, conspiracy theories. I've had people swear to me that they saw a missile and others that they saw an airplane and that they were there at the Pentagon, for example, on 9/11. That's the challenge here. And the other challenge with Kennedy, not all this information has been released to the public yet. It should be by now, but not all of it is. So watch those 3 little clips, especially the JFK smoking gun one, and tell me what you think. All right, that'll answer the question, maybe, of who actually shot John F. Kennedy. Oswald shot him, and his conclusion is somebody else shot him in the head, and it wasn't who you probably think it would be. So let's turn our attention to Lyndon Johnson, who was Kennedy's vice president. You can see he'll take over. He'll be sworn in on the airplane flying Kennedy's body home. Mrs. Kennedy will be there too. He'll be sworn in. He will win the 1964 election, and then he will step down and not seek re-election in 1968, which he could have by law. Because of the 10-year rule, he actually makes it in there. So Johnson patterns himself after Franklin Roosevelt. I mean, why wouldn't he? Franklin Roosevelt was super popular. So we talked about Franklin Roosevelt being this great big progressive. So is Lyndon Johnson in many ways. And that really comes out in his social program, which he calls the Great Society. So you know how Franklin Roosevelt had the New Deal, Johnson has the Great Society. I would put it in these terms. It's a war on poverty. Unfortunately, it seems to have been about as effective as this war on drugs or the war on terror that we've been involved in, right? It doesn't seem like necessarily it's going anywhere. And I'm not sure that the war on poverty has gone anywhere either. In fact, poverty levels are almost exactly the same now in 2020 than they were in 1964, 1965, when a lot of these programs were put in place. Nevertheless, this is the idea that he's operating under. So he feels like too many people are in poverty. It is a period of time in the 60s where technology is playing a bigger and bigger role in things. I know people today look back on the 60s and we think technology, but remember, the technology in the 60s compared to the technology in the 30s is completely different. It just like the technology today is completely different than it was in the 90s. I mean, in the 90s, we didn't really have the internet, for example. So some of us here that can remember that, remember, hey, life was different. And so today, as you're all understanding more and more now, you've got to be able to use a computer to get by in this culture, in this society. You've got to be able to use a computer to do almost any job. And so the idea there is we need to help people. So there is a number of pieces to the Great Society, and it has to do with things like the civil rights. If poverty is connected to opportunity, then minority people in this country are definitely lacking in opportunity. So it makes sense that a Civil Rights Act would be passed in keeping with this Great Society situation. If we want to help people, we've got to give people an equality of opportunity. So that's what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is supposed to do. It's not perfect, and it won't fix the problems right away. These are, remember, generational problems that we're working on here. But it will outlaw segregation, basically, in every way. And it'll talk about ethnicity, skin color, and some other categories. And we've added other categories since. So the Civil Rights Act is big. Now, we often think of Martin Luther King here. We'll get to him more in a minute, but this is where he's super active, is in the 1960s. All right. Well, another piece of this is welfare. So helping people that are poor or in poverty get out of poverty. And so that's going to be things like welfare programs. It's going to be things like Medicare, Medicaid. They're going to revamp Social Security. It's going to be about job retraining. There's all sorts of different aspects to this whole big picture of great society. But again, a big piece of that is going to have to be civil rights. Disproportionate numbers of Black Americans, for example, are in poverty, or Native Americans are in poverty. And so this is going to help fix that. Again, we have a long way to go. The other big thing, of course, and maybe the thing that overshadows anything and everything that Johnson did, was Vietnam. So Johnson sort of gets credit, and rightly so, for getting us into Vietnam proper as a war in 1964. But the reality is Vietnam goes all the way back to the 50s. And Eisenhower and the United States, we were supporting South Vietnam with money. And this goes back to containment policy, and this goes back to that chart we showed you in the previous lecture, that you are either a communist or a not communist. And because North Korea was communist, we were supporting the not communist, North Vietnam was communist, we are supporting the not communist South Vietnam. And they were not a great government, but they were not communist. So Eisenhower is going to be putting money there. Kennedy was a huge proponent of that. He supported that kind of help. Kennedy was very, very strongly against communism. When Kennedy became president, we scaled up our involvement and started sending advisors and CIA to try to help them fight this war, to try to help them root out spies. Any of you that were involved in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan understand how hard it is to tell who a friend is and who an enemy is. And in Vietnam, they're all Vietnamese, right? And Northern Vietnamese don't necessarily look any different than Southern Vietnamese. Just like in Iraq, you look at these different religious groups, they all look the same. And so we should know by now how hard this is, because it doesn't work very well. Well, when Johnson becomes president, this thing blows up into full-scale war with the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and then that sort of goes into a police action. We're going to spend hundreds of thousands of troops in Vietnam over the next 10 years. And so then you go to Nixon, and we'll talk about Nixon in the next lecture. Nixon has to deal with Vietnam too, and so it'll be full-blown war for most of his presidency, and then it'll basically scale back and end by the time he resigns or shortly after he resigns. So we'll talk more about Vietnam with Nixon, but this war is hugely unpopular, and I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to come back to Martin Luther King in just a second. This war is hugely unpopular, but it is just one more example of a containment policy war, of a proxy war. Clearly, the Chinese and the Russians are behind the North Vietnamese, and clearly the Americans are opposing that, and it's mostly American troops there. We never really directly come in contact with the Russians, so we're fighting this proxy war. But it is hugely unpopular in America. The draft continues. So unlike World War II, where the draft basically sifted out who could go to war and who needed to stay, we wanted to make sure we had enough manpower here. This war is not nearly as big, and people don't want to go, and so the draft is forcing people to go. My father was already in the Army. He actually got out in 1963, so he missed it, but one of my uncles was in the war. A lot of my friends were in the war. Some joined to, get the kinds of assignments they wanted and didn't wait to get drafted. But there are basically two kinds of Vietnam War veterans, right? Those that will talk about it and those that won't. Because those guys, when they came back, they were not popular. They were treated very poorly. This war unfolds on television, on the news. We have embedded news reporters. We're getting video on it constantly about the number of people that are getting killed. And about 50, maybe almost 58,000 Americans are killed in the 10 years we were really fighting the war part. And it's super unpopular, and everyone's protesting it, and things are really, really difficult. And what you have in America are a good deal of people who are very unhappy with this situation. soldiers included. So it's those veterans were treated very poorly. They were called names. They were yelled at, baby killers, all this stuff. This kind of thing, with very few exceptions, does not happen today, and did not happen in this generation. Soldiers, sailors, Marines are all treated, airmen, they're all treated for the most part with great respect and thanks. But that wasn't the case in the 60s, right? So hugely unpopular. Keep in mind, it's unfolding on television. More people are actually seeing it, and they're not just hearing about it, not just reading about it, they're seeing it. And we're asking the question, and we would have asked the same question, I think, in the 50s. It's just, remember, no one really asked questions in the 50s. But here we're saying, why are we doing this? What is the point? Why are we selling our sons' lives for this, for them? What does it matter? And in the end, we're going to leave, and North Vietnam's going to take over South Vietnam. And it seems like a huge waste. So where Korea, we held the line, in Vietnam, it just gets into this long, drawn-out conflict, and it becomes super political, and eventually we left, and it all fell apart. Sounds kind of familiar to certain things that are happening today. So this is Vietnam. Now, I'm going to go back to Martin Luther King a little bit. So the speech that this picture represents was actually given before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in response to a Civil Rights Act that got hung up in Congress a year or two earlier. So this speech, we call it the I Have a Dream speech, and you should Google it and watch it. By now, King has become sort of the face of the civil rights movement. So you have Rosa Parks and King, kind of, she's the poster child and he's the mouthpiece. He's a doctor, a reverend, very intelligent, very well spoken, and he is on the forefront of this, and he's on TV, and he parks himself in front of the Lincoln Memorial, which is on purpose. So he's on the steps. There's Lincoln behind him on his throne, right? Lincoln's the great emancipator. Of course, across the reflection pool is Washington's spire, and there's a couple 100,000 people in there, and this is on television, and he gives the speech. And the gist of the speech is what it says in this particular quote: I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That's what I hope we would all hope, and what we would all strive for, and what we would all live for. But he does it in context of the Constitution works. We need to apply it similarly to everyone, fairly to everyone, and we need to get rid of this notion of color and race, which is the same exact message that Webb Du Bois preached, 40 years earlier, only he never got anywhere because no one was willing to change. And it's the same message that Frederick Douglass preached in the Civil War era, and all of them basically said the same thing, that if we take the Constitution and we apply it fairly to everybody, we will all be fine. And again, we're still working on that. So he gets credit for that. Unfortunately, he too was assassinated in the 1960s, along with John F. Kennedy's brother Robert was assassinated also at a different point. So a lot of crazy assassinations happening in the 1960s. But that's it for this period of time. Next time we're going to talk about Watergate. So we're going to talk about Nixon and Watergate. We'll probably talk a little bit about hippies and sort of the counterculture, which I briefly talked about in this lecture. So stay tuned for Watergate. You might do a little research on what that means.